Helen sat on a folding chair in the empty service bay, the concrete cold even through her thin slacks. She watched her husband, Frank, stand silhouetted against the open rectangle of the door, his hands on his hips, staring out at the land they now owned. He was a statue of quiet contemplation, a man carved from 76 years of hard work and harder lessons. The gas station, a derelict husk on a forgotten county highway, was their entire world now. It was their last stand. Behind the crumbling brick building, where decades of oil and gasoline had poisoned the earth, a small patch of green was defiantly pushing its way toward the sun. In that patch of turned soil, they had found it. Not treasure, not gold, but something far more valuable. They had found the thing that saved them. It was a simple cast-iron hand pump, the rusted heart of a deep, forgotten well, and from it came the sweet, clean water that had washed away the grime of their despair and allowed life to begin again. This place, built on their last $200 and the sheer force of their will, had become a sanctuary, a home not just for them, but for the other lost souls who had drifted into its orbit. And their son, the one who put them there, had no idea. He had left them for dead, but he had misjudged the resilience of roots that had spent a lifetime growing deep. But to understand what that humming well and that quiet patch of green really meant, you have to go back. You have to go back to the silence. The silence was the first sign. It was a new kind of quiet, different from the comfortable peace that had settled over their small, paid-for house in the evenings. This was a hollow silence, the kind that fills a space where a voice is supposed to be. Frank and Helen sat in the sterile anonymity of the motel room, the floral-patterned bedspread scratchy against their skin. The television was on, but the sound was muted. They had been watching the local news without sound for 3 days. Frank stared at the screen, his face impassive, but Helen knew he wasn't seeing the smiling news anchor. He was seeing the calendar on the wall. He was seeing the days tick by. 1 week, then 2. "He'll call," Frank had said on the 3rd day. It wasn't a statement of faith. It was a command to the universe, a desperate attempt to bend reality to his will. Helen had nodded, her fingers tracing the seam on the cheap motel pillow. "Of course he will, dear. He's just busy. Busy." Their son, David, was always busy. He was a man of great importance, a builder of things, a creator of upscale condominiums that gleamed with chrome and glass. He had a busy life, a busy wife, and 2 busy children they rarely saw. His success had been a source of immense pride for them. They had bragged about him to their neighbors, to the cashier at the grocery store, to anyone who would listen. Our son, the success. It was that success that had brought them here, to this room that smelled of industrial cleaner and quiet desperation. "It's an investment, Dad," David had explained, spreading glossy brochures across their worn kitchen table. The house, their home for 47 years, suddenly looked small and shabby next to the architectural renderings of the pinnacle at River's Edge. "We sell the house," he'd said, his voice smooth and confident, the voice he used with city council members and bankers. "We put that money into this project. It's a guaranteed return, better than any savings account. And the best part? You'll have a brand new 2-bedroom unit waiting for you. Top floor. No more stairs, no more mowing the lawn. You've earned it." They had trusted him. Of course they had. He was their son. Frank, a man who had spent his life with his hands covered in grease, fixing things that were broken, understood tangible assets. He understood the reassuring weight of a wrench in his palm, the solid feel of a well-built engine. He did not understand variable interest rates or capital gains, but he understood his son, or so he thought. Helen, who had spent 30 years as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm, had felt a flicker of doubt. The numbers seemed too perfect, the promises too bright. But she had looked at Frank's hopeful face, at the pride in his eyes as he listened to their boy, and she had silenced the small, cautious voice in her head. This was for Frank. He deserved an easy retirement. So they signed the papers. They packed up nearly 5 decades of life into cardboard boxes, labeling them with a black marker. Kitchen. Frank's tools. Photos. They watched as the moving truck pulled away, carrying their past to a storage unit David had arranged. Just for a few weeks, David had assured them, handing them a key card to the Executive Stay Motel. The apartment's final touches are being put on. You'll be more comfortable here than in a dusty construction site. The first week had felt like a strange vacation. They ate at the diner next door. They walked through the nearby park. They waited. The second week, the calls to David started going to voicemail. Hey, son, just checking in. Give us a call. The third week, the texts went unanswered. The replies stopped. Now it was the fourth week. The silence was no longer hollow. It was heavy. It was a physical weight pressing down on them in the climate-controlled air of room 214. Frank finally broke the quiet. I'm going to his office. Helen looked at him. His jaw was set, a stubborn line she knew well. It was the same look he got when faced with a strip bolt or a seized engine. Determination. Frank, maybe we should just wait, she said, though her own hope was a flickering candle in a hurricane. Wait for what, Helen? For him to forget our address? For the money to run out? He gestured around the small room, at the two double beds, the particle board desk, the mini fridge humming a mournful tune. This was supposed to be for a few weeks. The prepaid motel stay, which David had covered for a month, was ending in 3 days. Their savings, once a comfortable cushion for their old age, had been liquidated and invested. They had a few $1,000s in their checking account, the remnant of their last Social Security deposit. After that, nothing. The proceeds from the sale of their house were gone, vanished into the corporate ether of D. Miller Developments, LLC. Helen didn't argue. She watched him pull on his good jacket, the one he saved for holidays. She saw him square his shoulders, a man preparing for a battle he didn't know how to fight. He was a mechanic. He fixed broken things. He had no idea how to fix a broken promise. He returned 3 hours later. The jacket seemed to hang off his frame, all the fight gone out of it. He sat heavily on the edge of the bed and stared at the carpet. He wasn't there, he said, his voice flat. The receptionist, a young woman with blue hair, she said Mr. Miller was in a very important meeting and couldn't be disturbed. Helen waited. I told her I was his father. I told her I would wait. Frank shook his head slowly. She looked at me, Helen, like I was a piece of dirt she had to sweep up. She said, Mr. Miller has left explicit instructions that he is not to be disturbed by anyone. Then she picked up the phone and started talking, like I wasn't even there anymore. He had become invisible. They both had. Old people in a motel, waiting for a phone call that would never come. That night, the despair settled in for good. It wasn't a sharp pain anymore. It was a dull, chronic ache. They were adrift, cut loose from everything they had ever known. Their home was gone. Their savings were gone. Their son was gone. Helen lay awake long after Frank's breathing had evened out into a troubled sleep. She stared at the ceiling, at the faint, shifting patterns of light from the cars on the highway. She was a bookkeeper. She understood ledgers. She understood assets and liabilities. And as she lay there, she began to do the math of their lives. On one side of the ledger was everything they had given, decades of love and support. The down payment for David's first car, the tuition for his business degree, the nest egg from her own parents handed over to him to start his company. All of it given freely, an investment in their child's future. On the other side was what they had received, a motel room, a condescending receptionist, and a silence that screamed betrayal. The ledger didn't balance. It was a catastrophic loss. The next morning, Helen made a decision. Despair was a luxury they could no longer afford. It was an indulgence that would leave them on the street when the key card stopped working. While Frank showered, she opened her old, slow laptop. The motel Wi-Fi was sluggish, but it worked. She ignored the news sites, the social media feeds filled with pictures of other people's happy lives. She went to the county website. She was a bookkeeper. She understood numbers. She understood value. She started looking not for apartments, but for property, land, something tangible, something that couldn't be promised away over a glossy brochure. The listings were a testament to forgotten dreams. Overgrown lots, foreclosed houses with caved-in roofs, commercial properties long since abandoned. The prices were astronomical, even for the ruins. Thousands, tens of thousands of dollars they did not have. She scrolled for hours, her hope dwindling with each click. The numbers were a relentless tide, pulling her under. She was about to close the laptop, to surrender to the inevitable, when she saw it. A hyperlink at the bottom of the page, county tax auction. She clicked. It was a list of properties seized for unpaid taxes. Most were worthless slivers of land, inaccessible and unusable. But one listing caught her eye. Parcel 7B for 12 acres. Commercial zoning. Property includes derelict service station structure. Sold as is. There was a single, grainy photo. A brick building with boarded-up windows and a collapsed awning. Weeds grew tall and thick from cracks in the concrete. The price was listed as a minimum bid. $200. Helen stared at the number. $200. It was an absurdly small amount. It was a clerical error. It was a joke. But it was there. It was a number she could understand. It was a number they could afford. Just. She looked at the location on the map. It was miles out of town, on a road that was little more than a line on the screen, a place where the neat grid of the suburbs frayed into the empty spaces of the county. When Frank came out of the bathroom, steam billowing around him, she turned the laptop toward him. "What is it?" he asked, toweling his gray hair. "It's a gas station," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's for sale. We can buy it." Frank leaned over, squinting at the screen. He saw the rust, the decay, the utter hopelessness of the place in the pixelated image. He saw a ruin. "Helen, that's a pile of junk," he said, his voice laced with the exhaustion of a man who had already lost too much. "What are we going to do with a pile of junk?" Helen didn't look at the picture. She looked at him. "It's ours, Frank," she said. "Or it can be. It's a place to stand. No one can take it from us. No one can ask us to leave." It was the last part that hit him. No one can ask us to leave. The daily humiliation of walking past the front desk, of feeling the clerk's eyes on them, wondering when their time would be up. The fear of that key card flashing red instead of green. He looked back at the screen. He was a mechanic. He had spent his life bringing dead things back to life. He saw the collapsed awning and thought of rusted hinges. He saw the boarded windows and thought of broken seals. He saw the overgrown lot and thought of choked fuel lines. It was all broken, but he knew how to fix broken things. He looked at his wife, at the strange, fierce light in her eyes. He hadn't seen that light in a long time. It was the look she'd had when she'd balanced the books for his first garage, turning a shoebox full of receipts into a viable business. It was the look of a woman who saw a solution where he only saw a problem. He nodded, a single, slow dip of his chin. "All right, Helen. All right." 2 days later, on the morning their motel key was set to expire, Helen sat in the cold, impersonal lobby of the county tax office. She held a cashier's check for $200, the last of their readily available cash. Frank waited in their old sedan, the engine running. He was too proud, too defeated to come inside. Helen was the only one who bid on parcel 7B4. The auctioneer called the number, his voice bored. Helen raised her hand. He banged a small gavel. And just like that, they were property owners again. They didn't go back to the motel. They had checked out that morning, their few belongings packed into the trunk of the car. There was nowhere to go but forward, to their gas station. The drive-out was quiet. The city gave way to suburbs, then to farmland. The roads grew narrower, the houses farther apart. They followed the directions from Helen's phone until it lost its signal. They were on their own. Finally, they saw it. It was worse than the picture. Much worse. The reality of it was overwhelming. The brick was crumbling in places. The mortar turned to dust. The sign, a tall metal pole, was rusted through, its plastic letters long gone, leaving only a ghostly outline of a forgotten brand. The concrete was a mosaic of cracks, and a small, wiry tree was growing defiantly through the middle of the pump island. Frank pulled the car to a stop on the gravel shoulder and killed the engine. The silence that rushed in was different from the motel's silence. This was an older, more natural quiet, punctuated by the chirping of unseen birds and the rustle of wind through the tall, dry weeds. They sat for a long time, just looking. This was it, the sum of their lives. A ruin on the side of a road to nowhere. "Well," Frank said, his voice raspy. "It's still standing." Helen reached over, and put her hand on his arm. "Let's go home." Frank got out of the car. He walked to the front door of the main building. It was plywood, nailed shut. He gripped the edge and pulled. The wood was rotten, and a large piece splintered off in his hand. He peered into the darkness within. The smell hit him first. Damp, musty earth, oil, and something else, the faint, sharp scent of animal life. He pulled harder, and the rest of the plywood came away with a groan of rusty nails. He stepped inside. Helen followed, her hand on his back. Sunlight streamed through the grime-caked windows, illuminating a scene of total decay. The sales counter was still there, its laminate peeling. Empty shelves lined the walls. The floor was a carpet of dirt, leaves, and trash. In the corner, a pile of rags and newspaper showed where some animal had made a den. They explored the rest of the small building. A tiny, filthy bathroom, a storage closet, and behind a door, the 2 service bays. These were vast, cavernous spaces. The ceilings were high, crisscrossed with steel beams. One bay had a hydraulic lift, frozen in a half-raised position like a skeletal hand reaching for the ceiling. The other was empty, save for a heavy wooden workbench built against the far wall. Light filtered down from high, dirty windows. It was here in the empty bay that Frank stopped. He ran his hand over the surface of the workbench. It was thick, solid oak, scarred and stained with the ghosts of 1,000 repairs. It was a proper workbench. He knew this bench. He had worked on benches like this his entire life. He looked at Helen. For the first time since they had left their house, he saw a flicker of something other than despair in his eyes. He saw a problem he could solve. "The roof looks solid in here," he said, his voice echoing slightly in the large space. "We can patch that one leaky spot. We can sweep the floor. We can make this work." Helen felt a wave of relief, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. He wasn't giving up. He was seeing it now. Not the ruin, but the foundation. Their first night was miserable. They slept in the car, the seats digging into their backs. The night was cold, and the old car's heater was unreliable. They ate crackers and canned tuna from the small stash of groceries they'd bought. But as they sat there in the dark, looking at the black shape of their building against the star-dusted sky, they weren't in a motel room waiting for someone else's permission to exist. They were on their own land. The next morning, the work began. It was a monumental task, an archaeological dig through layers of neglect. They started with the empty bay. Frank found a rusty snow shovel and began to clear the floor, scraping away years of accumulated filth. Helen used a tattered piece of cardboard to sweep the debris into piles. It was slow, backbreaking work. Their bodies, softened by years of a more comfortable life, ached and protested. Every muscle screamed. But with every shovelful of dirt, with every pile of trash removed, they were not just cleaning a floor. They were reclaiming a piece of their lives. They were imposing order on chaos. By the end of the day, a large patch of the concrete floor was visible. It was stained and cracked, but it was solid. Frank used a crowbar he found in the trunk to pry the boards off one of the bay doors. The mechanism was rusted solid, but he managed to prop it open a few feet, letting in fresh air and afternoon light. They brought in their folding chairs and sat in the middle of their small, clean space. They were exhausted, filthy, and sore, but they had made a mark. "We need supplies," Frank said, looking up at the hole in the corrugated metal roof. "Tar, some sealant, and bolts. I need some half-inch carriage bolts." Helen did the math in her head. Their checking account was perilously low. "We can afford a few things," she said, "but we have to be careful." The nearest town was a 15-minute drive away. It was a small, sleepy place with a single main street. They found a hardware store, a real one, with wooden floors that creaked and a smell of sawdust and metal. Hobbs Hardware, the sign read. An old man with a friendly, wrinkled face and a faded flannel shirt stood behind the counter. "Help you folks?" he asked. Frank, feeling self-conscious in his dirty clothes, described what he needed. He listed the items with the precision of a lifelong mechanic. The man, who introduced himself as Earl Hobbs, listened intently, nodding. "Fixing up a place?" Earl asked as he gathered the supplies. "Something like that," Frank said, not wanting to explain their circumstances. Earl looked at Frank's hands. They were caked with dirt, but he saw the calluses, the stained fingernails, the geography of a life spent working with tools. They were hands he recognized. They were hands like his own father's had been. When he had everything on the counter, he rang it up. The total came to $78. Helen winced. It was more than she had budgeted. She pulled out her debit card, but Earl held up a hand. "Tell you what," he said, looking Frank in the eye. "You look like a man who knows his way around an engine. I've got a generator out back that's been giving me fits. You get it running for me, and we'll call it even for this stuff." Frank was taken aback. "You don't even know me." Earl shrugged. "I know the hands, and I know an honest face when I see one. What do you say?" It wasn't charity. It was a transaction, a trade. It was a language Frank understood perfectly. "I say you've got a deal," Frank said, a genuine smile spreading across his face for the first time in weeks. He spent the next hour in the dusty storeroom behind the shop, hunched over the stubborn generator. His hands, guided by instinct and decades of experience, moved with a purpose he hadn't felt in years. He cleaned the carburetor, replaced the spark plug, and adjusted the fuel line. He gave the cord a firm pull. The generator sputtered, coughed a plume of blue smoke, and then roared to life with a steady, reassuring hum. Earl clapped him on the shoulder. "Knew you could do it." He insisted they take a few extra things, a heavy-duty broom, a box of trash bags, 2 work gloves. "On the house," he said. As they drove back to the gas station, the mood in the car had shifted. The small act of kindness, of professional respect from a stranger, was like a splash of cold water on a hot day. It was a validation. They were not just two old people in a broken-down car. Frank was a mechanic. Helen was a bookkeeper. They had skills. They had value. That afternoon, Frank patched the roof. He moved with a new energy, his movements sure and economical. Helen, meanwhile, tackled the interior of the station's small office. She scrubbed the grime off the windows, washing away the cataracts of neglect until clear, bright sunlight could finally stream in. She swept the floor, wiped down the counter, and threw out bags of trash. It was still a wreck, but it was their wreck, and it was slowly, painstakingly, becoming something more. That evening, they set up 2 cots they'd bought with their remaining cash in the clean service bay. They cooked soup on a small camp stove. The single bare bulb Frank had wired to the car battery cast a warm, yellow glow over their makeshift home. It was the best meal Helen had tasted in a month. The next few weeks fell into a rhythm. They worked from sunup to sundown. Frank focused on the structure. He secured the other bay door, cleared the overgrown vegetation from around the building, and began the long, arduous process of sorting through the junk left behind by the previous owners. He found a treasure trove of old tools, rusted but salvageable. Each one he cleaned and sharpened felt like recovering a lost piece of himself. Helen focused on making the space livable. She scrubbed, she organized, she painted the office walls with a can of mismatched white paint Earl had given them. She established a small kitchen area with a hot plate and their cooler. She used her bookkeeping skills to stretch their dwindling funds, meticulously tracking every penny. Their Social Security check arrived, a lifeline that allowed them to buy more supplies and food. Section, they were a team, moving with the unspoken coordination of 2 people who had shared a life for half a century. The doer, the observer. Frank built and repaired. Helen planned and managed. One sweltering afternoon, as Frank was trying to unfreeze the bolts on the old hydraulic lift, a sputtering, clanking sound echoed down the empty road. A beat-up compact car, trailing a thin plume of smoke, rolled to a stop right in front of their station. A young woman got out. She couldn't have been more than 20. She was holding a baby wrapped in a thin blanket. Her face was pale with panic. "Please," she said, her voice trembling. "My car. It just died. I don't know what's wrong. Do you have a phone I can use?" Helen saw the desperation in her eyes, the dark circles of exhaustion. She saw the baby, listless in the heat. "We don't have a phone," Helen said gently. "But my husband is a mechanic. Let him take a look." Frank wiped his greasy hands on a rag and walked over. He listened to the engine, checked under the hood, and diagnosed the problem in under a minute. A broken alternator belt. I don't have a replacement for this model, he said, but I can probably rig something to get you to town. The young woman, whose name was Maya, burst into tears. I don't have any money to pay you, she sobbed, and I have nowhere to go in town anyway. Helen put a comforting arm around her. First things first, she said, leading her toward the shade of the service bay. Let's get you and the little one out of this heat. They spent the rest of the afternoon with their unexpected guests. Helen gave Maya a bottle of water and held the baby, a little girl named Lily, while Maya cooled down. Frank, ever the pragmatist, managed to fashion a temporary belt from a piece of old rubber he'd found. As dusk began to settle, Maya's car was running again, albeit roughly. I can't thank you enough, Maya said, her eyes still red from crying. She looked down the long, empty road. I guess I should go. Where will you go? Helen asked, her voice soft. Maya hesitated, then the story came tumbling out. A boyfriend who had turned mean, a family that had turned their back on her. She had been living in her car for a week, driving aimlessly, trying to figure out what to do. Helen looked at Frank. He looked back at her. No word were needed. They had a roof, patched though it was. They had a floor, clean though it was stained. They had more than this young woman and her child did. You can't drive that car at night, Frank said gruffly. It's not safe. You can stay here. We have an extra cot. Maya's eyes filled with tears again, but this time they were tears of gratitude. Are you sure? We're sure, Helen said. You can stay as long as you need. Maya stayed the night. She stayed the next day, helping Helen clean and organize. She was a hard worker, eager to contribute. She had a quiet strength about her that reminded Helen of herself at that age. The presence of the baby, Lily, brought a new kind of life to the old gas station. Her soft gurgles and occasional cries were a stark contrast to the silence they had grown used to. One night turned into a week. Maya became part of their small, strange family. She helped with cooking and cleaning, and her youthful energy was infectious. She was good with numbers, and she helped Helen set up a more detailed budget, finding ways to save money they hadn't thought of. The gas station was no longer just a shelter for Frank and Helen. It was becoming a haven. Word began to spread in the small, rural community. It started with the farmers. Frank, needing a small income, put a hand-painted sign out by the road. Small engine repair, a farmer with a broken tiller was his first customer. Frank fixed it in an hour and charged him a fair price. The farmer returned the next day with a basket of fresh vegetables from his garden and 2 friends who had broken lawnmowers. Soon, a steady trickle of customers came to their door. They brought broken generators, stubborn chainsaws, and weary weed whackers. Frank, in his element, worked happily at his bench, his hands once again finding their purpose. He didn't charge much, sometimes trading his work for supplies, a bag of potatoes, a cord of firewood, a few gallons of gasoline for their car. Helen managed the accounts, logging each transaction in a neat ledger. It wasn't charity. It was a functioning ecosystem, a small community built on mutual need and respect. People started to drop things off even when they didn't need a repair. A stack of old lumber, a box of mismatched dishes. A retired electrician came by one day and, in exchange for Frank fixing his boat motor, helped him properly wire the service bay and install safe, modern light fixtures. They were building something, not just repairing a structure, but weaving a new social fabric. They, who had been discarded by their own family, were now the center of a new one. But their quiet, industrious world was about to be threatened. The Black County sedan pulled up one Tuesday morning, dust billowing behind it. A man in a crisp uniform with a clipboard got out. He had the unmistakable air of a man who enjoyed delivering bad news. He introduced himself as a code enforcement officer. He walked around the property, his lip curled in a permanent sneer. He made notes on his clipboard. "You can't live here," he said, his tone final. "This property is zoned for commercial use only. It's not a residence." "We're fixing it up," Frank said, his hands clenched at his sides. "You're living in a garage," the man scoffed. "It's a violation of a dozen county codes. Health, safety, zoning. Take your pick." He tore a sheet from his clipboard and tacked it to the door of the office. It was a condemnation notice. It was printed in bold, red letters. They had 30 days to vacate the premises. After that, the county would take action to have the structure demolished. The officer got back in his car and drove away, leaving them standing in a cloud of dust and disbelief. The red paper on the door felt like a physical blow. It was the system, impersonal and implacable, coming to sweep them away again. For a day, the despair returned, thicker and more suffocating than before. They had worked so hard. They had built something from nothing. And now it was all going to be taken away. Maya was the one who broke the spell. "We can't just give up," she said, bouncing a fussy lily on her hip. "There has to be a way." Helen, the bookkeeper, the observer, went into action. She spent the next day at the town library, using their computer to research county zoning laws. She read through pages of dense, bureaucratic language, searching for a loophole, a crack in the wall of regulations. She found one. It was a small, obscure ordinance for live-work artisan spaces. It allowed for a residence to be attached to a commercial enterprise, provided certain safety and sanitation standards were met. The standards were strict. They would need proper plumbing, a certified septic system, specific electrical wiring, and a dozen other things they did not have. The task seemed impossible. Frank, meanwhile, had gone to see Earl at the hardware store. He told him what had happened. Earl listened, his face growing grim. "That's Henderson," Earl said, naming the code officer. "He's a by-the-book man with a sour stomach. Thinks he's the king of the county." He tapped his fingers on the counter, thinking. But he's not the only one who knows the book. Earl made a phone call. An hour later, a man named George pulled up to the hardware store. He was in his late 70s like Frank and Earl, with a clear, steady gaze. George had been the county's chief building inspector for 30 years before he retired. He knew the codes better than Henderson did. They all drove out to the gas station. George walked through the property, not with a sneer, but with a professional, appraising eye. He looked at Frank's work, at the patched roof, the clean floor, the sturdy workbench. He listened as Helen explained her research into the live-work ordinance. "It's possible," George said, stroking his chin. "It's a long shot, and it'll be a hell of a lot of work in 3 weeks. But it's possible." And then the community rallied. Earl put the word out. The farmer whose tiller Frank had fixed showed up with his 2 sons and a tractor with a backhoe attachment. They offered to dig the trench for the septic system. The retired electrician returned, this time with a crew of friends, and they began the complex job of bringing the entire building's wiring up to code. Someone donated a used but functional water heater. Another dropped off a sink and a toilet salvage from a remodeling job. It was an astonishing outpouring of support. People they barely knew, people who were customers, neighbors, or just strangers who had heard the story, arrived with tools, materials, and helping hands. They worked from dawn until well after dark, a frantic, coordinated effort against the ticking clock of the 30-day notice. It was during this flurry of activity, in the middle of the second week, that the sleek, black luxury sedan appeared. It looked alien and out of place amidst the dusty pickup trucks and old farm vehicles. David got out. He was wearing an expensive suit, his shoes immaculate. He looked around at the scene, at the half-finished plumbing, the piles of lumber, the group of strangers working on his parents' strange, squalid project. His face was a mask of horror and embarrassment. He found Frank and Helen near the office, conferring with George over a set of hand-drawn plans. "What is this?" David demanded, his voice sharp. "What in God's name are you two doing?" Frank just stared at him, his face unreadable. Helen stepped forward. "We're building a home, David," she said, her voice calm and even. "A home? This is a dump. I heard you were living out here like vagrants." I didn't believe it. He shook his head, looking disgusted. "This is humiliating. What will people think? My clients, my partners. What if they see this?" It was all about him, his reputation, his image. Helen felt a cold, clarifying calm settle over her. The last embers of her maternal affection for the man standing before her flickered and died. He was a stranger. "We needed a place to live," she said simply. "You'll recall our other arrangements fell through." David had the grace to look away for a second. "Look, that was a business deal that went south. It was complicated. I was going to. I was going to sort it out. Were you? Helen's voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a shard of glass. Were you going to sort it out before or after our month at the motel ran out? Before or after you stopped taking our calls? Before or after your receptionist told your father you were too busy to see him? He flinched at each question as if it were a physical blow. This is ridiculous, he finally sputtered. He pulled out a checkbook. Look, I'll give you money. Enough to get a decent apartment, a nice one. Just stop this. Shut this whole thing down and go away. Disappear. For my sake. He scribbled a number and tore out the check, holding it out to her. Helen didn't even look at it. She looked at his face, at the son she had raised, and she felt nothing but a profound and weary pity. He didn't understand. He couldn't. We don't want your money, David, she said. We have everything we need right here. She gestured around at the bustling work site, at the faces of the people who had come to help them. This is our home. These are our friends. Frank finally spoke. His voice was low and gravelly. You should go now. David stared at them, his face a mixture of anger and confusion. He crumpled the check in his fist. Fine, he snarled. Fine. Right out here for all I care. Don't come crying to me when they bulldoze this place. He stormed back to his car, spun the tires in the dirt, and sped away. No one had stopped working, but everyone had heard. When the dust from David's car settled, the farmer's son started up the backhoe again, and the sound of its engine was a defiant roar. The work continued with a new, grim sense of purpose. The next 2 weeks were a blur of frantic construction. They encountered a major problem when they tried to drill a new well. The ground was rocky and unforgiving. The cost of hiring a professional driller was far beyond their means. It seemed like an insurmountable obstacle. Without a reliable water source, they would never pass the inspection. It was Frank who made the discovery. While digging the trench for the septic line behind the station, his shovel hit something hard with a dull thud. He cleared away the dirt and found a heavy, concrete cap, nearly hidden beneath the soil. With the help of 2 other men, he pried it open. Beneath it was a deep, stone-lined shaft, an old well, not marked on any county map. They lowered a bucket on a rope, and it came back up, heavy with cold, clear water. It was a miracle. Earl found an old, cast-iron hand pump in the back of his store, and Frank and the others spent a day restoring it and setting it over the wellhead. The day of the inspection arrived. It was a cool, clear morning. The work was done. The service bay had been transformed. One half was still Frank's workshop, neat and organized. The other half was a small, efficient living space. The office was now a clean, bright bedroom. There was a small, fully functional bathroom. It was unconventional, but it was clean, safe, and solid. The entire community seemed to be holding its breath. Earl was there. George was there. The farmer and his sons, the electrician, and a dozen other people who had helped stood by, a silent show of support. Henderson, the code officer, pulled up in his sedan. He got out with his clipboard, a smug look on his face, clearly expecting to sign the final condemnation order. He walked into the service bay and stopped dead. His jaw literally dropped. He stared at the newly painted walls, the gleaming plumbing fixtures, the neatly organized workspace. He walked through the small apartment, his eyes wide with disbelief. He flushed the toilet. He turned on the sink. He inspected the electrical panel. He was silent for a long time, making notes on his clipboard. Frank and Helen stood together, their hands clasped, waiting for the verdict. Finally, Henderson looked up. He looked at Frank, at Helen, and then at the crowd of people standing in the doorway. He looked at George, the retired inspector, who gave him a slight, knowing nod. Henderson cleared his throat. Well, he said, and his voice had lost its sneering edge. It's unorthodox, he paused. But according to Code 17, subsection B, regarding mixed-use artisan dwellings, everything appears to be in order. He clicked his pen. He signed the bottom of the form with a flourish and handed it to Helen. You've passed, he said, a grudging respect in his eyes. This isn't a gas station anymore. It's a home. A cheer went up from the small crowd. Helen felt Frank's hand tighten on hers. She looked down at the paper, at the official stamp of approval. Vindicated. The story didn't end there. A reporter for the local weekly paper, hearing whispers of the gas station people, came out to do a story. He was expecting a tale of poverty and squalor. He found a story of resilience, community, and rebirth. The article, Couple Builds Haven from Ruin, was a local sensation. It was picked up by a regional news outlet, and then, inexplicably, it went viral online. The story of the elderly couple betrayed by their son, who then built a new life and a new community in an abandoned gas station, resonated with thousands of people. The publicity had consequences. David's business partners saw the story. His investors saw it. In the world of high-end real estate, reputation is everything. The story of how he had treated his parents was a stain on his carefully crafted image. Deals began to fall through. Partners pulled out. His gleaming empire, built on a foundation of broken promises, began to crumble. Justice, it turned out, sometimes arrived not with a gavel, but with a shared link. Life at the gas station settled into a new normal. It was a quiet, purposeful existence. The small community that had formed around them became a permanent fixture. Maya and Lily stayed, becoming the daughter and granddaughter they had lost. Maya, with Helen's guidance, enrolled in an online accounting course. Frank started teaching his mechanical skills to a couple of the local teenagers, his workshop becoming an informal trade school. The garden they had planted behind the station, in soil they had painstakingly cleared of its toxic past, began to thrive, watered by the sweet, cool water from the forgotten well. They grew tomatoes, squash, and beans, more than enough for themselves, and they shared the rest. One afternoon, a car they didn't recognize pulled up. It was a woman about David's age. It was his wife, Jennifer. She got out of the car, looking nervous. She was carrying a small, potted orchid. She apologized. For David. For herself. For not paying closer attention. She told them David's business was failing, that he was a broken man. She didn't ask for forgiveness, only to explain. Helen accepted the orchid. The door is always open, Jennifer, she said. It was all that needed to be said. David never came. The silence from him was now permanent. But it was no longer a heavy, oppressive silence. It was just an absence, a space that had been filled by other, better things. By the sound of Lily's laughter, by the hum of a well-tuned engine, by the quiet conversation of friends sharing a meal at the end of a long day. That evening, Frank and Helen sat on a bench Frank had built from salvaged lumber, a place where they could watch the sunset paint the sky with strokes of orange and purple. The old gas station sign, which Frank had repaired and fitted with a single, energy-efficient bulb, glowed softly in the twilight, a beacon of welcome on the quiet country road. Frank took Helen's hand. Her fingers, wrinkled and worn, fit perfectly in his, calloused and strong. They had lost everything they thought was important. Their house, their money, their son. And in losing all, they had found what truly mattered. They had found a foundation that could not be shaken. They had found a community that could not be broken. They had found a home built not on land or with money, but with their own two hands and the goodness of strangers. Helen leaned her head on Frank's shoulder, watching the last sliver of sun disappear below the horizon. The light on the old sign hummed its quiet, steady song, pushing back the darkness. They were home.